Hello everyone, welcome to the second installment here of week 7 content. So we're talking about conjugacy in symmetric groups of permutations. The first round for this week we talked about the disjoint cycle description of a permutation. Now we're going to see what the connection is between that description and conjugacy, the concept of conjugacy and conjugacy classes in Sn. So let's have a look at an example. And in S7, the symmetric group of degree 7, let's let pi be the permutation that takes the 5 cycle, that takes 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, and 5 back to 1, and that fixes the elements 6 and 7. And let's let sigma be this particular permutation, which is supposed to be sort of a generic permutation in S7, written in its standard array format. And let's calculate the element that you get if you conjugate pi by sigma by taking sigma after pi after sigma inverse. Okay, so basically, our question is going to be: what does that element look like as a product of cycles, essentially? And can we describe what it looks like without having to go through the whole process of computing these compositions from scratch? Okay, well, let's see. Pi has 5 elements that are cycled around and 2 that are fixed, namely 6 and 7. And sigma, here's sigma. It's sort of difficult. We haven't written it in cycle form. We've just written it in its sort of list format. But if we think about applying sigma inverse, and then pi, and then sigma, all the information we need is here. So remember, sigma inverse takes the second row there to the first row, which reverses the work of sigma. And if we look at the elements 1 and 4, which I'm choosing to focus on, because sigma inverse takes them up to 6 and 7, which are the fixed points of pi. And look at what the composition sigma after pi after sigma inverse does to those 2 elements. Well, sigma inverse lifts 1 and 4 up to 6 and 7. Then pi fixes both 6 and 7. And then sigma drops 6 and 7 back down to 1 and 4. Okay, so basically what happens to 1 and 4 when you apply sigma after pi after sigma inverse is sigma inverse lifts them up to 6 and 7. Pi leaves them there. Sigma drops them back down again to where they came from, to 1 and 4. Okay, so basically they just get lifted up by sigma inverse and drop back down by sigma, because pi doesn't do anything to the 6 and 7 that you reach after applying sigma inverse. So basically the elements 1 and 4, they're fixed, not by sigma or by pi, but by the composition sigma after pi after sigma inverse, because what that composition does to them is just lift them up to 2 fixed points of pi, drop them back down again. Okay, so 1 and 4 are fixed points of sigma pi, sigma inverse. Okay, fine. What about the rest of the elements? Well, pi cycles around the elements 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It takes 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, and 5 back to 1. The images of those elements under sigma are 2, 7, 6, 3, 5 in that order. So when we apply sigma inverse to 2, 7, 6, 3, 5, we just lift them up to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that's fine. Then pi cycles those elements around. Takes 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 5 back to 1, and then sigma just drops them back down again. So if we look, for example, at what happens to 2 under the composition pi after sigma after pi after sigma inverse, 2 gets lifted up to 1 by sigma inverse, then it gets carried along to 2 by pi, then it gets dropped down to 7 by sigma. So overall, 2 goes to 7. So I use a different color for the composition. Under sigma pi sigma inverse, 2 goes to 7. 7 gets lifted up to 2 by sigma inverse, then moved to 3 by pi, then dropped down to 6 by sigma. 6 gets lifted up to 3, moved over to 4, dropped down to 3. 3 gets lifted up, moved over, dropped down. So 3 goes to 5, and 5 gets lifted up to 5 by sigma inverse, then cycled around to 1 by pi, then dropped down to 2 by sigma. So overall, the effect on those 5 elements of sigma pi sigma inverse on 2, 7, 6, 3, 5 is that they get cycled around. And our conclusion is that the conjugate sigma pi sigma inverse, it cycles around the elements 2, 7, 6, 3, 5, which are the images under sigma of the elements that are cycled around by pi, and it fixes the other 2 points, 1 and 4. So basically our conclusion is sigma pi sigma inverse is 2, 7, 6, 3, 5. Pi was the 5 cycle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this conjugate of pi has the same cycle type as pi itself. It consists of a single 5 cycle and 2 fixed points. and the elements that are cycled around by this conjugate of pi are the images under sigma of the elements that are cycled around by pi itself. So that's what happens to a single cycle when you conjugate it by another element in a symmetric group. And the next observation is that that's not really special to a single cycle. So there's a sort of general description here, which might be a little bit difficult to digest. So it's followed by an example, which might be a bit easier to see what's going on. The basic idea is, if we've got an element pi of Sn, we can write it as a product of disjoint cycles, which are noted here by pi 1, pi 2, up to pi k. So those are cycles, which each of them cycles around a particular bunch of elements, and the elements cycled around by different pi i's are different elements. They're disjoint cycles. Okay, so pi is the product of these disjoint cycles. And if you want to look at sigma pi sigma inverse, that is sigma pi 1, pi 2, up to pi k, sigma inverse. And then the key observation is to notice that basically you can insert a sigma inverse sigma between every pair of different factors pi's here. So you can write this as sigma pi 1, sigma inverse sigma pi 2. The sigma inverse sigma is just a copy of the identity, so it doesn't really have an effect. But you can sort of separate the sigma inverse and sigma into from each other and write this as a product of factors. Sigma pi 1 sigma inverse, which is a conjugate of pi 1, sigma pi 2 sigma inverse, which is a conjugate of pi 2, and so on. So to get from the first line to the second one here, all you've done is insert a bunch of copies of sigma inverse sigma between all the appearances of the factors pi I, and that's just a copy of the identity in each case, so it doesn't affect your overall product, but it allows you to write this conjugate sigma pi sigma inverse as the product of conjugates sigma pi I sigma inverse. The reason for this is we know what they look like because they're in the context of the last slide. They're just cycles of the same length as each of the pi i's that cycles around the images under sigma of the elements cycled by pi I. So to see how this works for a particular example, let's drop all these pi i's and give ourselves a specific example. So here's a permutation pi in S10, which has a 4 cycle and a 5 cycle and a fixed point. The fixed point of pi is 9, I think. It's the one that doesn't appear in the description here. And here's a permutation sigma in S10 again. Okay, so sigma is supposed to be a sort of generic representative example of an element of S10 here. And pi is this particular element that has this particular cycle structure. It has a 1 cycle, a 4 cycle, and a 5 cycle. Okay, then the assertion is that sigma pi sigma inverse, if we conjugate pi by sigma, we should again get something which has a 4 cycle, a 5 cycle, and a fixed point. The terms that get cycled around in the 4 cycle should be the images under sigma of the elements that are cycled by the 4 cycle in pi. And we can read those off from the description of sigma. 1487 goes to 9384. So we get a cycle 9384. 210365 goes to 5, 7, 6, 110. So we get a cycle 5, 7, 6, 110. And the fixed point of pi, which is 9, gets taken to 2. 2 is going to be a fixed point of sigma pi sigma inverse. It doesn't appear in either of these cycles. So yeah, so the conclusion is, if we take a permutation in S10 that has a particular cycle type in terms of how many cycles of each length it has, when you conjugate it by some element sigma, you preserve that cycle type. So we still have a 1 cycle, a fixed point, a 4 cycle, and a 5 cycle. And the elements in each of those corresponding cycles are the images under sigma of the ones in the corresponding cycle in pi. And that essentially is how conjugation works in symmetric groups in Sn. So elements of Sn that are conjugate to each other have the same so-called cycle type. That means they have the same number of fixed points, the same number of 2 cycles, the same number of 3 cycles, and so on for each possible cycle length. And in this case, it's a 1, a 4, and a 5. And of course, the 1 plus 4 plus 5 makes up 10, which is the degree of the symmetric group that we're in. Okay, so that's kind of what conjugacy means in symmetric groups. It just corresponds to cycle type. And something that we haven't quite shown yet is that if 2 elements do have the same cycle type, then they are conjugate. So in other words, here's an example. In S8, we have a pair of elements, tau and pi. Tau and pi have the same cycle type in S8. Each of them consists of a pair of disjoint 3 cycles and a pair of fixed points that aren't explicitly listed. So tau, for example, has 2 3 cycles, and it fixes the elements 3 and 4, which aren't appearing in either of the 3 cycles. Pi also has 2 3 cycles with disjoint sets of elements involved in them, and it fixes the elements 7 and 8, which are not listed amongst the 2 3 cycles there. So the assertion would be that because these two elements have the same cycle type, they should be conjugate to each other. So we should be able to produce a sigma for which when we conjugate tau by sigma, by forming sigma tau, sigma inverse, we get pi. And if you want to actually write down a particular sigma, a particular permutation sigma in S8 that does that trick, what you want sigma to do is you want it to take the elements 2, 5, 8, which are in a 3 cycle of tau, to the elements in one of the 3 cycles of pi, preserving the cyclic order. So for example, you could take 2, 5, 8 to 4, 1, 6 in that order. You could also take it to 1, 6, 4, which has the same cyclic order. But if we take the elements 2, 5, 8 of the first of the 3 cycles there of tau, and take them to 4, 1, 6, which are appearing in the first of the 3 cycles listed in pi in the same cyclic order, then we can take the 3 elements 1, 6, 7 to 5, 3, 2, 1, 6, 7 to 5, 3, 2 in that order. We could also have taken 1 to 3, 6 to 2, 7 to 5, because that would be the same cyclic order. We could write 5, 3, 2 equally well as 3, 2, 5. Okay, so there are options here for what we can do with sigma. And then finally, the fixed points of tau, which are 3 and 4, we take them to the fixed points of sigma, which are 7 and 8. And again, we can do that in either of 2 possible ways. We can take 3 to 7 and 4 to 8, or we can take 3 to 8 and 4 to 7. And that will give us a different sigma. So basically, we can write down a sigma. In fact, we can write down multiple choices of sigma that do this trick, for which sigma tau sigma inverse is equal to pi. And we can observe that, yes, these 2 elements do have the same cycle type. They are conjugate to each other in S8. And our conclusion is that a pair of elements in S8 are the same conjugacy class, they're conjugate to each other, if and only if they have the same cycle type. That when you write down the product of disjoint cycle expressions, they have the same structure. So they have, in this example, 2 3 cycles and 2 fixed points. Okay, so this is quite a nice thing because it relates conjugacy classes in symmetric groups to certain sort of themes from number theory, including the concept of partitions of an integer. So like the conjugacy classes in Sn correspond to the possible cycle types of a permutation in Sn. So for example, if we're in S7, you could have a cycle type that has a 2 cycle and a 5 cycle. You could have a cycle type that has a 1 cycle and a 6 cycle, a fixed point and a 6 cycle. You could have a cycle type that has a 3 cycle and a 4 cycle. And the different possible cycle types that you can have in S7 or in Sn correspond to the so-called partitions of n. The partitions of a positive integer are the different ways of writing that positive integer as a sum of positive integers. So for example, if you take your positive integer to be 4, there are the following ways of writing 4 as a sum of positive integers. You can write 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. That would correspond to the cycle type consisting of 4 fixed points, which is just the identity element. You can write 1 plus 1 plus 2. That corresponds to 2 fixed points and 1 cycle of length 2. You could have 2 plus 2. That would be 2 cycles of length 2, 2 disjoint cycles of length 2. You could have 1 plus 3. That would be a single 3 cycle and a fixed point. Or you could have just 4, which would be a single cycle of length 4. So the conjugacy classes in Sn correspond to the partitions of n, the ways of writing n as a sum of positive integers. The problem of counting the partitions of a positive integer is a difficult problem of number theory. There are recursive formulas for it, but there isn't a sort of neat formula that tells you in terms of n how many partitions n has. So if n equals 7, for example, we can say that the partition 2 plus 2 plus 3 of 7 corresponds to permutations with a cycle type, a 2 cycle, a 2 cycle, and a 3 cycle. So there's an example of a permutation that has that cycle type, and of course the entries that appear in each cycle are disjoint from each other in all cases. None of them are shared. And the other thing you can do is you can count the number of permutations in each conjugacy class by counting the number that have a particular cycle type. So for example, here, if we're in S7, we have 7 choose 3 choices for the 3 elements to put into the 3 cycle. That's the number of ways of choosing 3 elements from 7. And after you've chosen the 3 elements to put into your 3 cycle, you can arrange them in cyclic order. Okay, and the number of ways to do that for 3 elements is basically if your elements are 5, 6, 7, there's essentially 2 different cyclic orders you can write down. There's nothing lost by putting 5 in the first slot. But then you've got a choice because you don't care about the starting elements, you only care about the cyclic order. So if you agree you're going to put 5 in the first position of 5, 6, and 7, then you've got 2 choices for what goes in the second position. You can put 7, and then 6, or you can put 6 and then 7. And those are the two ways of writing 5, 7, 6 in cyclic order. 5, 7, 6 is the same as 7, 6, 5 and 6, 5, 7, but it's different from 5, 6, 7. Okay, so basically, once you've chosen the three elements that go into your 3 cycle, there are 2 different choices for how to write them in cyclic order. Okay, basically you care about if you're writing them around in a circle. I guess I should try to be a bit careful and write them the way that was chosen here. If you write them around in a circle, you don't care what the starting point is. So, you know, the 5, 7, and 6, any of them could appear anywhere around this, but you care whether it's 5 going to 6 going to 7, or whether it's 5 going to 7 going to 6, because those are 2 different cycles. Okay, so the number of ways to choose the 3 cycle is 7 choose 3 for the 3 entries that go into it, times 2 factorial for the number of ways to arrange those elements in cyclic order. Then after that, you've got 4 elements left, and they have to be split into 2 cycles, 2 disjoint 2 cycles. So if your 4 elements that are left are 1, 2, 3, and 4, basically you've got 3 choices for what the partner of 1 is going to be. It can be 1, 2, and then 3, 4. It can be 1, 3, and then 2, 4, or it can be 1, 4, and then 2, 3. So there are 3 ways to arrange the remaining 4 elements into a pair of disjoint 2 cycles. And so for every choice of 3 cycles, there are 3 choices for the pair of 2 cycles. So in total, we've got 7 choose 3, which is 35, times 2 is 70, times 3 is 210 permutations belonging to that particular conjugacy class, consisting of permutations in S7 that have a 2 cycle, a 2 cycle, and a 3 cycle. Okay. If you take another partition, and of course you can do this for all of them until you get tired of it. Take a partition, for example, 1 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3. That corresponds to permutations that have a 2 cycle and a 3 cycle, and 2 fixed points that are disjoint from those. So for example, 1, 2 is a 2 cycle, 3, 4, 5 is one such example. It fixes the elements 6 and 7. And the number of that type, well, again, we've got 7 choose 3 choices for the 3 elements to go into the 3 cycle. And after you've chosen them, you've got 2 factorial ways to arrange them in cyclic order. After you've done that, you've put 3 elements into your 3 cycle. You have 4 elements left. You've got 4 choose 2 ways to choose 2 of those to go into the 2 cycle. And in doing so, you're also choosing the 2 fixed points. Once you've chosen the pair of elements to go into the 2 cycle, there's no choice about how to order them. They just get swapped. The 2 cycle is just a swap of 2 elements. So here we get 7 choose 3, which is 35, times 2 is 70, times 4 choose 2, which is 6. So we get 420 elements of S7 in this particular cycle type, or in the particular conjugacy class. So there's a lot more detail about this idea of counting elements in conjugacy classes in section 2.3 of the lecture notes. So I certainly advise you to have a look at that in detail, as well as having a look at this video, which hopefully conveys some of the key ideas. If there's more detail needed, or if you'd like another video lecture in more detail on this topic, please just let me know. We can easily do that. And that takes us to our challenge for week 7. We've only got one this week. And our challenge for week 7 is a counting problem. So basically, going back to that last example, where we produced an example of an element sigma, for which sigma tau, sigma inverse is equal to pi, for this example of a pair of permutations pi and tau with the same cycle type in S8. Question is, how many choices for sigma did we have? Just going back to the way that we constructed that particular example of a sigma. And it's a counting problem, but it's not a completely easy one. There are some things that could easily be accidentally missed. So think about that, see how you get on, and let me know. So that's it for today. Thanks a lot, everyone, and we'll see you on Thursday and Friday this week. Take it easy.